A little girl's desperate pleas echoed through the modest apartment as she clutched her schoolbooks with trembling hands. "Mom, don't tear up my schoolbooks," she begged, tears streaming down her paralyzed body's face, unaware that a millionaire was about to walk through their door and change everything forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9 as Emily Smith sat alone in her bedroom on the second floor of the Smith mansion. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The 12-year-old's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her notebook, its pages filled with complex mathematical formulas written in blue ink. Her determined eyes scanned the equations, finding comfort in their logical precision, while the rest of her world remained chaotic and unpredictable. Emily shifted in her wheelchair, the metal frame catching the soft glow of her desk lamp. The chair had been both her prison and her sanctuary since the accident 3 years ago, the same accident that had taken her mother from her. She glanced at the framed photograph on her nightstand, her mother's smiling face frozen in time, eyes bright with a life now extinguished. The gentle tick of the antique clock echoed through the cavernous room, marking seconds that stretched into minutes, minutes into hours. Outside, streetlights flickered on one by one, painting the manicured garden in an ethereal glow. Emily's father, David Smith, was working late again at his corporate office downtown. His absence had become so routine that the young girl hardly noticed anymore. She reached beneath her pillow and pulled out her mother's journal, its leather cover worn smooth from countless nights of being held close. Emily's fingers traced the embossed initials, C.S., Catherine Smith, before carefully opening to a dog-eared page. "Numbers are the universe's secret language," her mother had written. "When words fail, equations speak truth." The familiar handwriting was a fragile tether to a love lost too soon, each loop and curve preserving a piece of the brilliant mathematician who had first inspired Emily's passion. The mansion's oppressive silence was broken only by the scratching of Emily's pencil as she worked through a particularly challenging theorem. In these quiet moments, she could almost pretend that nothing had changed, that her mother might walk through the door at any moment with a challenging puzzle or a warm embrace. The hinges of her bedroom door creaked, startling Emily from her calculations. Mrs. Johnson appeared in the doorway, her silver hair neatly pinned back, carrying a tray with a bowl of steaming chicken soup and a slice of freshly baked bread. The elderly housekeeper's kind eyes crinkled with concern as she took in the sight of the young girl surrounded by books and papers, clearly having forgotten dinner again. "You need to eat something, dear," the housekeeper said gently, placing the tray on the bedside table. "Your father called. He'll be home late again." Mrs. Johnson placed the tray of soup on the bedside table, her silver hair catching the dim lamplight. The housekeeper's back was slightly stooped from decades of service to wealthy families, a physical testament to her years of dedication. She studied Emily Smith with eyes that had witnessed the family's transformation from happiness to heartbreak. "You forgot to eat again, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle but firm. The aroma of chicken soup wafted through the room, a homemade recipe Mrs. Johnson had perfected over the years specifically for Emily. The young girl's eyes flickered between the steaming bowl and the mathematical proof sprawled across her notebook. Her wheelchair was positioned perfectly at her desk, surrounded by textbooks well beyond her grade level. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but the equations before her seemed more urgent, more comforting somehow. "I just wanted to finish this proof before it disappeared from my mind," Emily murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers, small yet determined, gripped her blue pen tightly, as if afraid the solution might escape if she let go. "It's almost done. Just one more step." Mrs. Johnson sighed, understanding the weight pressing on those small shoulders. She knew that mathematics wasn't merely homework for Emily. It was escape, control, and connection to her mother, who had once been a brilliant mathematician herself. The elderly woman carefully sat on the edge of the bed, her joints protesting slightly as she lowered herself down. "Your mother would want you to eat," she said softly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from Emily's face. "Even geniuses need nourishment." Emily's eyes welled with tears at the mention of her mother. The mansion felt emptier each day, despite its grand size and expensive furnishings. Her father, David Smith, was rarely home, burying himself in work since his wife's passing. And Linda, her stepmother, made the atmosphere cold whenever she was present. The silence between them spoke volumes, of unspoken heartache, of a child forced to grow up too quickly, of a caretaker who had become the closest thing to family in this enormous, lonely house. Mrs. Johnson didn't rush Emily, didn't force cheerfulness or demand conversation. She simply existed beside her, a steady presence in a world that had proven itself unstable. "5 more minutes?" Emily asked, her eyes pleading. The housekeeper nodded, her weathered hand gently squeezing Emily's shoulder. 5 minutes, then soup, young lady. No negotiations." Her stern tone was betrayed by the warmth in her eyes, the kind of compassion that had made this mansion bearable for Emily since her mother's death. The phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet like a knife, startling both Emily and Mrs. Johnson. Emily's wheelchair squeaked as she quickly spun toward her nightstand, heart leaping when she saw the caller ID illuminated on the screen. "Dad!" she exclaimed, her voice suddenly alive with hope. Mrs. Johnson smiled knowingly, handing the device to Emily before discreetly stepping back. "I'll give you some privacy, dear," she whispered, moving toward the door but lingering just outside, her weathered face showing both relief and concern. Emily Smith's thin fingers trembled as she accepted the call, pressing the phone eagerly to her ear. "Dad, are you coming home soon?" The words tumbled out in a rush, her blue eyes bright with anticipation. She clutched her mother's journal closer to her chest with her free hand, as if somehow her late mother could share in this rare moment of connection. "Hey, sweetheart." David's voice sounded distant, the background noise of his office nearly drowning out his words. "Just checking in to see how you're doing with your studies." The businessman's tone was distracted, the familiar sounds of paper shuffling and keyboards clicking, painting a clear picture for Emily. Her father was still deeply immersed in work, his attention divided. "I'm doing really well," Emily replied, straightening in her wheelchair, desperate to hold his attention. "I solved that differential equation we talked about last month, and I've been reading Mom's notes on—" "That's great, Em," David interrupted, not unkindly but clearly preoccupied. "Listen, I've got to run into another meeting. These investors from Chicago won't wait. Mrs. Johnson is taking good care of you, right?" Emily's face fell, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, she's here. She brought soup." "Perfect. Don't stay up too late. I'll try to be home before you're asleep." The hesitation in his promise was unmistakable. "Okay, Dad. I love—" The call ended before she could finish, the sudden silence more deafening than any noise could have been. Emily lowered the phone slowly, staring at the darkened screen. The room seemed colder now, the walls of the mansion pressing in around her. Mrs. Johnson quietly re-entered, her experienced eyes taking in the slump of the child's shoulders, the unshed tears. "He's very busy," Emily whispered, more to herself than to the housekeeper, her small voice echoing in the large bedroom. "The company needs him." Mrs. Johnson placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, but said nothing. What could she say? The distance between father and daughter stretched far beyond physical space, a chasm growing wider with each missed dinner, each abbreviated phone call. Each night Emily fell asleep, waiting for footsteps that never came. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, each one tightening the knot in Emily's stomach. The rhythmic click of high heels against marble floors was unmistakable. Mrs. Johnson stood, her weathered hands smoothing her apron as she braced herself. The door swung open, with practiced drama, to reveal Linda Smith, Emily's stepmother, her striking presence framed in the doorway like an unwelcome painting. "Still playing with your little numbers, I see," Linda said, her voice honey-coated, yet sharp enough to cut. Her designer dress rustled as she stepped into the room, expensive perfume overwhelming the comforting scent of Mrs. Johnson's soup. Emily's fingers instinctively tightened around her notebook. "I'm working on a math problem for school," she whispered, eyes downcast. Linda's sharp gaze swept the room, landing on the equations Emily had carefully written across the window with erasable marker. A mocking smile curled her lips as she traced a manicured finger through one of the formulas, smudging it beyond recognition. "Such a waste of time," she sighed theatrically. "You should focus on something more appropriate for your condition." Mrs. Johnson cleared her throat. "Miss Emily has quite a gift for mathematics, ma'am. Her teacher says—" "I don't recall asking for your opinion," Linda cut in, her smile never reaching her eyes. The housekeeper fell silent, but remained standing protectively near Emily's wheelchair. Linda circled the room like a predator, picking up and discarding Emily's belongings with casual disregard. "Your father called. He'll be working late again." She delivered this news with barely concealed satisfaction, knowing how it would wound the child. Emily's face fell, but she quickly masked her disappointment. "He's very busy at the corporation," she defended, voice small but determined. "Yes, well," Linda replied, examining her perfect nails, "someone has to pay for all this, don't they? Your special needs aren't exactly inexpensive." The words hung in the air like poison. Emily flinched as though physically struck, her eyes filling with tears she refused to shed. "Perhaps it's time for your medication," Mrs. Johnson suggested firmly, moving toward the door. "I'll fetch it from downstairs." "No need to rush off," Linda said, her words sweet yet laced with contempt. "I'd like a moment alone with my stepdaughter." She emphasized the word with subtle distaste. Mrs. Johnson hesitated, her loyalty to Emily warring with her position as an employee. The elderly woman's eyes met Emily's, silently promising to return quickly. As the door closed behind the housekeeper, Linda's smile vanished completely. She turned toward Emily, her expression hardening as she approached the wheelchair. Emily's hands tightened around her notebook, knuckles turning white as Linda took another step toward her. The wheelchair seemed to shrink beneath her, offering no escape from her stepmother's advancing shadow. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "This won't help you," Linda sneered, her manicured fingers reaching for the notebook Emily clutched against her chest. "All these equations and formulas? Do you really think they'll make your legs work again?" The girl's blue eyes welled with tears, but she held firm, pressing the precious pages closer. Inside that notebook weren't just mathematical problems. They were her mother's legacy, the language they had shared before illness took her away. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast bedroom of the mansion. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her elderly frame positioning itself between them like a weathered shield. The housekeeper's silver hair caught the lamplight as she stood her ground, protective instincts overriding her position as an employee. "Ma'am, it's late," the older woman said firmly. "The child needs rest. Please wait until morning." Her hands trembled slightly, but her stance remained resolute. She had watched over Emily since before the accident, had wiped away countless tears during the long nights when David Smith was absent, buried in work and grief. Linda's eyes flashed with cold anger, the striking beauty of her face transformed into something harsh and unforgiving. "Are you telling me how to parent my stepdaughter?" Her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You forget your place in this household." The housekeeper flinched, but didn't move. "Mr. Smith wouldn't want." "My husband isn't here," Linda cut her off. "And if you value your position, you'll leave this room immediately." Her perfectly painted lips curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. Unless you'd prefer to pack your things tonight? After 30 years, finding new employment at your age would be challenging, wouldn't it? Mrs. Johnson's shoulders sagged. The threat hung in the air, chilling and effective. She looked at Emily with apologetic eyes, weathered hands reaching out briefly before falling back to her sides. "I'll be just down the hall," she murmured to the girl, the promise clear in her tone. She would listen for any sound, any cry. As the door closed behind the housekeeper, Emily felt the last barrier between herself and Linda's cruelty disappear. The mansion suddenly felt impossibly large and empty, with no one to witness what might happen next. Linda's smile widened as she stepped closer to the wheelchair. The door clicked shut, leaving Emily Smith alone with her stepmother. The silence between them felt electric, dangerous. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her notebook tighter against her chest, the pages filled with equations that had been her only escape. "Please, Mom, don't touch my notebook," Emily pleaded, her voice barely audible in the vast bedroom. Tears welled in her eyes. Reflecting the dim light from her bedside lamp, Linda's laughter cut through the air like glass, sharp, cruel, devoid of warmth. "Mom, I'm not your mother," she sneered, her striking features contorting with disdain. "Your mother is gone, and these childish scribbles won't bring her back." In one swift motion, Linda snatched the notebook from Emily's grasp. The young girl's fingers, so small and desperate, clawed at the air as her most precious possession was torn away. "No!" Emily cried out, her voice breaking. The sound of paper tearing filled the room, violent, final, like thunder in the confined space. Linda ripped page after page, mathematical formulas and careful notes scattered like wounded birds. Each tear seemed to cut directly into Emily's heart. Desperate to save her work, Emily lunged forward in her wheelchair. The sudden movement sent the chair tipping precariously. For one suspended moment, Emily felt weightless, then came the impact, her small body crashing onto the hardwood floor with a sickening thud. Pain shot through her arms and shoulders, but Emily barely noticed. She dragged herself across the floor, gathering torn scraps of paper to her chest as if collecting pieces of her shattered soul. "Look at you," Linda taunted, standing over the fallen child. "Pathetic. Your father wastes his money on tutors and special programs, but for what? You'll never imagine." Emily remained on the floor, her tears falling onto the torn pages, blue ink beginning to blur beneath the droplets. In this moment, surrounded by the ruins of her work, she had never felt more alone or more helpless in the vast mansion that had once been her home. Linda's eyes darted around the room like a predator seeking new prey. The destruction of Emily's notebook hadn't satisfied her craving for dominance. Her gaze landed on something peeking from beneath Emily's pillow, a worn leather-bound book with faded gold lettering. Recognition flashed across her face. "What's this?" Linda snatched the diary with manicured fingers, her wedding ring catching the light as she flipped through the delicate pages. "Your precious mommy's little book of secrets?" Emily's heart froze. That diary contained all she had left of her mother. Handwritten thoughts, sketches, and words of love intended only for her daughter. The pages were yellowed with age and stained with tears shed during countless nights when Emily had clutched it to her chest, imagining her mother's voice reading the words aloud. "Please," Emily begged, her voice cracking with desperation. She tried to pull herself up from the floor, her useless legs sprawled beneath her. "That's all I have left of her. Please, don't touch it." The stepmother's lips curled into a cruel smile as she dangled the diary just out of reach. "All these years, and you still can't let go? This is why you're so damaged, Emily, living in the past with a dead woman's scribbles." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she dragged herself forward using only her arms, her wheelchair forgotten behind her. The hardwood floor scraped against her knees, but she barely noticed the pain. The physical hurt was nothing compared to watching Linda's fingers tighten around the last tangible connection to her mother. "Your father doesn't need these reminders of her," Linda hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And neither do you." She gripped the diary with both hands, positioning her thumbs to rip it down the spine. The binding creaked in protest as Emily let out a wail that seemed to come from somewhere primal and wounded inside her. "Mom, please don't." The word mom slipped out, not for Linda, but as a desperate cry to the universe, to her real mother, to anyone who might stop this violation. Linda paused, savoring the moment. The wealthy woman's face transformed with dark pleasure at Emily's suffering. She began to pull the covers apart, the sound of tearing paper filling the room like a thunderclap. "This is for your own good," she said, watching Emily's face crumple. "It's time you learned that nothing lasts forever. Not your mother's love, not your father's attention, and certainly not this pathetic little book." The front door of the mansion crashed open with such force that the crystal chandelier in the foyer trembled. Heavy footsteps thundered across the marble floor below, each one more urgent than the last. Emily's tear-filled eyes darted to the doorway, a flicker of desperate hope cutting through her despair. David Smith appeared like an avenging angel, his expensive suit rumpled from a day of meetings, his tie loosened at the neck. He stood frozen for 3 heartbeats, taking in the devastating tableau before him. His daughter sprawled on the floor beside her overturned wheelchair, torn pages scattered like fallen leaves around her small body. And Linda, his wife, standing triumphantly with the last tangible connection to Emily's mother dangling from her manicured fingers. "Enough!" The single word exploded from David's chest, filling the cavernous bedroom with raw, unleashed fury. The businessman's normally controlled demeanor had shattered completely, replaced by something primal and protective. Linda's face drained of color. The diary trembled in her grip as she took an instinctive step backward. Mrs. Johnson, who had been hovering anxiously in the hallway, pressed herself against the wall, her weathered hands clasped over her mouth. "Dad," Emily whispered, her voice breaking on that single syllable. Time seemed suspended in the mansion's stifling air. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock downstairs echoed through the silence like thunderclaps. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the tableau through the curtains, highlighting the tears on Emily's cheeks, the scattered mathematics that had been her refuge, the cruel triumph fading from Linda's expression. David's chest heaved as he struggled to contain the storm of emotions. His gaze moved from his daughter's crumpled form to the torn pages of her notebook, complex equations and formulas that reminded him so much of her mother's brilliant mind. His eyes finally locked onto Linda's, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the very foundation of their relationship. "Put it down." Each word fell like a stone into still water. Linda's fingers loosened on the diary, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. She hadn't expected him home. He was never home. The millionaire's unexpected arrival had demolished her carefully orchestrated moment of power over his child. Emily reached toward the diary with trembling fingers, her eyes never leaving her father's face. The father whose absence had left a void that Linda had filled with cruelty. The father who now stood before them, finally seeing the truth that had been hidden behind closed doors of their elegant prison. No one moved. No one breathed. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Linda's face drained of color as she dropped the diary to the floor with a soft thud. The leather-bound journal, Emily's most precious connection to her mother, landed just inches from the wheelchair tipped on its side. "David, I didn't mean," Linda stammered, mascara-stained tears suddenly streaming down her cheeks. Her perfectly manicured hands fluttered in frantic gestures as she backed away from Emily. She was being difficult. You know how stubborn she gets with her schoolwork. David Smith didn't blink. His normally tired eyes, usually softened by the weight of running his business empire, had hardened into something Linda had never seen before. The businessman's jaw clenched as he surveyed the scene. Torn notebook pages scattered across the expensive carpet, his daughter crumpled on the floor, and his wife standing over them both. "Save it," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The mansion seemed to hold its breath as he stepped past Linda as if she were invisible. David knelt beside Emily, his expensive suit pants pressing against the floor. With trembling fingers, he collected the diary and placed it gently back into his daughter's arms. The tenderness of this gesture stood in stark contrast to the coldness he'd shown Linda. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking as he noticed the fresh bruises forming on Emily's knees, where she'd hit the floor. The guilt in his eyes was unmistakable, not just for tonight, but for all the nights he'd been absent, all the times he'd left his child in the care of a woman who resented her very existence. Emily clutched the journal to her chest, her small body still shaking. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came home." The simple statement hit David like a physical blow. How many nights had she waited for him, hoping he'd return before she fell asleep? How many dinners had she eaten alone while he closed another deal? Linda stepped forward, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood. "David, please, you're overreacting. I was just trying to get her to focus on something practical instead of those silly equations." "Enough." David's voice thundered through the room as he carefully lifted Emily back into her wheelchair. His hands were gentle with his daughter, but his eyes, when they turned to Linda, were filled with a cold fury that made her physically recoil. Emily's fingers traced the worn cover of her mother's diary, her eyes never leaving her father's face, as if afraid he might disappear again if she looked away. Linda's face contorted as she clutched at David's sleeve. "You know I only wanted what's best for her." Her voice cracked with desperation, but the plea fell on deaf ears. David Smith had witnessed enough. The image of his daughter, sprawled on the floor, clutching torn pages to her chest, had shattered any remaining illusions about his marriage. Without a word, he reached into his suit jacket and produced a manila envelope. The papers inside made a soft whisper as they scattered across the polished hardwood floor. Divorce documents, already signed on his part, the culmination of months of silent preparation. "You're leaving tonight," he said, his voice as cold as winter steel. "I've been blind for too long." Linda's eyes widened in disbelief. She backed away, her designer heels catching on the edge of the Persian rug. "You can't do this to me," she hissed, her previous facade of concern evaporating like morning dew. "This is my home, too." "Not anymore," David replied, his gaze unwavering. "Everything you've done to Emily, every tear she shed because of you, it ends now." The mansion's intercom buzzed softly. David pressed the button on the wall panel, without taking his eyes off his soon-to-be ex-wife. "Mrs. Johnson, please come upstairs, and bring Mr. Brown with you." Linda's composure crumbled completely. She lunged toward Emily, who flinched and gripped her mother's diary tighter. "This is all your fault, you manipulative little." The door swung open, cutting off her venomous words. Mrs. Johnson stood in the doorway, her elderly frame somehow imposing in that moment. Behind her loomed Mr. Brown, the family's driver for 15 years, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. "Pack her things," David instructed, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Only what she brought into this marriage, nothing more." Linda's protests escalated to screams as Mrs. Johnson gently guided her toward the master bedroom. The housekeeper's face remained impassive, though her eyes held a glimmer of long-awaited justice. Mr. Brown followed silently, his presence alone enough to discourage any physical resistance. Within 20 minutes, Linda's designer suitcases were loaded into the trunk of the family's second vehicle. Her screams echoed through the marble hallway as Mr. Brown escorted her firmly but respectfully toward the front door. "You'll regret this, David. I'll destroy everything you've built." The heavy oak door closed with finality, muffling her threats. In the sudden silence, David turned back toward his daughter, his heart breaking at the sight of her tear-stained face and the scattered remnants of her work around her. The mansion fell into a profound silence after Linda's departure, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Emily Smith trembled in her father's arms, her small body still processing the trauma of what had just transpired. David Smith held his daughter close, feeling her fragile shoulders shake with each breath, painfully aware of how long he had been absent from her life. "I'm scared, Dad," Emily whispered, her voice so faint it seemed to dissolve in the air between them. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, searched his face for reassurance. David gently squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here now." The words felt both like a promise and an apology for all the times he hadn't been there. Mrs. Johnson quietly moved around the room, picking up torn notebook pages and placing them carefully on Emily's desk. The elderly housekeeper's eyes were moist, but her movements were purposeful, restoring order to the chaos Linda had left behind. "Would you like some tea, dear?" she asked Emily, her voice gentle as she straightened the girl's blanket. The young girl nodded, clutching her mother's diary to her chest like a shield. David noticed how his daughter's fingers traced the worn leather cover, a habit he recognized from years ago when his wife was still alive. "I thought she loved me," Emily said suddenly, her voice stronger now. "I tried so hard to make her happy." David's throat tightened with guilt. How had he missed the signs? How many nights had his daughter suffered while he buried himself in work at the office, telling himself it was all for her future? "None of this was your fault," he said firmly, carefully lifting Emily back into her wheelchair. "I should have seen what was happening. I should have been here." The businessman knelt before his daughter, meeting her eyes directly for what felt like the first time in years. Behind the pain, he saw his late wife's intelligence shining through, a reminder of all he had nearly lost. "We're going to start over," David promised. "Just you and me." Mrs. Johnson returned with a tray of steaming cups, the familiar scent of chamomile filling the room. Outside, the driver's car pulled away, taking Linda's possessions to be stored elsewhere. The sound of tires on gravel marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. As the doors closed behind Linda, sealing out years of cruelty, father and daughter sat together in the soft lamplight, sipping tea and beginning the delicate work of rebuilding trust. A fragile peace settled over the mansion, tentative but real. Linda's fury simmered beneath her composed exterior as she sat in the cramped room of the budget hotel. The peeling wallpaper and flickering lights were a stark contrast to the luxury she had grown accustomed to at the Smith mansion. She stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against the cheap laminate desk as her mind raced with thoughts of vengeance. "He'll regret this," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with rage. The humiliation of being escorted out by Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Brown still burned fresh in her memory. The divorce papers David had thrown at her feet represented not just the end of her marriage, but the end of her carefully constructed life of privilege. Linda Smith, soon to be ex-Smith, reached for her smartphone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for: Michael Davis. She had met the businessman at several corporate events, always noting the thinly veiled animosity between him and her husband. If anyone would help her destroy David, it would be his longtime business rival. The next evening, Linda stepped out of a taxi in front of an upscale bar downtown. She had spent her last bit of accessible money on a new black coat and lipstick, knowing appearances were everything in the world she was trying to manipulate. The establishment hummed with the quiet conversations of the city's elite, soft jazz playing in the background as amber lights cast dramatic shadows across expensive suits and cocktail dresses. Michael Davis sat in a corner booth, his calculating eyes watching the entrance. When he spotted Linda, a subtle nod acknowledged her presence. The businessman was known for his ruthless tactics in the corporate world, having tried to undermine David's company multiple times over the years. "Thank you for meeting me," Linda said as she slid into the booth opposite him, her voice honeyed but hollow. Michael signaled for the server to bring another drink. "I was intrigued by your message. It's not every day a man's wife reaches out to his competitor." "Soon-to-be ex-wife," she corrected, her eyes flashing with bitterness. "And that's precisely why I'm here." As the evening progressed and drinks emptied, Linda leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I'll help you destroy him. I know his weaknesses, his secrets, his vulnerabilities, especially regarding his daughter." Michael's eyes gleamed with anticipation as he raised his glass in a silent toast. "To new partnerships," he murmured. Their pact was sealed in shadows and hatred, neither aware that their scheme would ultimately strengthen the very bond they sought to break. The morning news hit like a hurricane. Linda had made good on her threat, feeding the press a twisted version of events that painted David Smith as a heartless monster. "Millionaire David Smith abandons paralyzed child," screamed the headlines across newspapers and digital media. Photos of Emily in her wheelchair, clearly taken without permission, accompanied stories filled with fabricated details about neglect and cruelty. Emily's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications as the story spread like wildfire across social media. Mrs. Johnson tried to shield her from the worst of it, confiscating the device before Emily could see all the comments. But the damage was already done. The housekeeper's weathered face creased with worry as she helped Emily prepare for school, knowing what awaited her there. "Perhaps you should stay home today," Mrs. Johnson suggested gently, brushing Emily's hair, "just until this blows over." But Emily shook her head. "I can't hide forever," she whispered, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. The moment Mr. Brown pulled the vehicle up to the school entrance, Emily could feel the stares. Conversations halted mid-sentence as she wheeled herself through the hallway. Former friends suddenly found their shoes fascinating, while others whispered behind cupped hands, their pitying glances worse than outright cruelty. "Poor thing," one girl murmured, loud enough for Emily to hear. "Imagine your own father not wanting you." In mathematics class, Mr. Robinson handed back their tests. When he reached Emily's desk, he placed her paper down with a sigh that carried judgment. "Perhaps your home situation is affecting your concentration," he said, though her work was nearly perfect. "Not everyone can handle advanced mathematics while dealing with personal difficulties." The classroom fell silent. Emily's cheeks burned as she stared at her paper, vision blurring with unshed tears. The teacher's implication hung in the air, that her disability and family situation somehow diminished her intellectual capabilities. During lunch, Emily wheeled herself to a corner table, alone with her untouched food. Conversations around her seemed to revolve around the news story, with occasional glances thrown her way. The isolation felt physical, a barrier as real as any wall. A group of older students walked past, one of them deliberately knocking her water bottle to the floor. "Sorry," the girl said with mock sincerity. "I guess nobody taught you how to keep things stable." Emily's fingers dug into her palms as she fought back tears. The cruelty of children, she realized, could be just as calculated as any adult's. The wounds they inflicted, invisible but deeper than any physical injury, would take far longer to heal. The hallways had become a gauntlet for Emily Smith. Whispers followed her wheelchair like persistent shadows, each one cutting deeper than the last. The headlines about her father had transformed her from the quiet math girl to the abandoned daughter of a heartless millionaire. During lunch period, Emily sat alone, her tray untouched as she tried to focus on her equations instead of the stairs. Her pencil case slipped from her lap, sending pens scattering across the polished floor. The laughter that followed made her cheeks burn with humiliation. As she struggled to reach down from her wheelchair, a hand appeared, gathering her fallen supplies. Jacob Johnson, a boy from her advanced math class, knelt beside her, his expression free of the pity she'd grown to despise. "Don't listen to them," he whispered, placing her favorite blue pen in her palm. "I believe in you." Those 4 simple words lingered in her mind throughout the afternoon, a small flame of hope in the darkness that had engulfed her life. When the final bell rang, Emily wheeled herself into Mr. Robinson's classroom for advanced mathematics, her heart still warmed by that unexpected kindness. The teacher barely acknowledged her entrance, his dismissive glance making it clear he'd read the morning papers. Emily positioned her wheelchair at a desk in the back corner, trying to make herself invisible. "Today, we're tackling differential equations," Mr. Robinson announced, writing a complex problem on the board. His eyes scanned the room before landing on Emily with calculated cruelty. "Perhaps Miss Smith would like to demonstrate her special abilities?" The classroom fell silent. Emily felt 20 pairs of eyes boring into her. Mr. Robinson's challenge hung in the air, a problem far beyond their grade level, clearly meant to humiliate her. Jacob caught her eye from across the room and gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Emily wheeled herself forward. The squeak of her wheels against the floor tiles seemed deafening in the silent classroom. She accepted the chalk from Mr. Robinson's outstretched hand, noting his smug expression. For a moment, she stared at the equation, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. Mathematics isn't just about finding answers, it's about seeing patterns others miss. Emily's hand moved across the board with surprising confidence. She approached the problem using a method she'd discovered in her mother's old research journals, an elegant solution that simplified the seemingly impossible equation. When she finished, she turned to face the class. Mr. Robinson's mouth hung slightly open, his smugness replaced by disbelief. The silence broke as Jacob started clapping, followed hesitantly by others until the entire room filled with applause. A stunned silence fell over the classroom. Every student froze, eyes fixed on the complex equation Emily Smith had just solved on the whiteboard, her wheelchair positioned squarely before the mathematical proof that had stumped even Mr. Robinson. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before Jacob Johnson's hands came together in a sharp clap that broke the spell. "That was incredible," Jacob exclaimed, his enthusiasm genuine as he continued applauding. One by one, the other students joined in until the room filled with applause. Emily's cheeks flushed with color as she wheeled herself back to her desk, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time since her mother's passing, she felt something other than shame or sadness. She felt pride. Even Mr. Robinson nodded with reluctant respect, clearing his throat as he struggled to find words. "Well done, Emily," he finally managed, though his tone suggested he hadn't expected such brilliance from the girl in the wheelchair. Emily caught Jacob's eye across the room, and he gave her a thumbs up. The warmth of accomplishment spread through her chest as she carefully arranged her notebook on her desk. Perhaps things were finally changing. Perhaps she could find her place here after all. The moment of triumph was shattered by the synchronized buzzing of phones throughout the classroom. Students reached for their devices, breaking school rules without hesitation, as notifications lit up screens. Emily watched their expression shift from curiosity to shock, then to poorly concealed interest as they glanced her way. "David Smith under investigation for neglect," read the headline that spread like wildfire. Emily's heart plummeted to her stomach as she caught glimpses of her father's name on multiple screens. Her moment of academic glory instantly forgotten, replaced by a cold dread that spread through her veins. "Emily's dad," whispered a girl 2 rows over, not bothering to lower her voice. They say he abandoned her." Mr. Robinson cleared his throat again, louder this time. "Phones away immediately," he commanded, but the damage was done. The whispers grew, swirling around Emily like poisonous smoke. She gripped the edges of her desk, knuckles turning white as new waves of gossip and suspicion crashed over her. Jacob looked at her with concern, but even his friendship couldn't shield her from the storm of speculation. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but for Emily, it marked the beginning of a new nightmare. As students filed out, their hushed conversations followed her like shadows. Her father, her protector against Linda, was now being painted as the villain, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across David Smith's study as he hunched over the fragments of his late wife's diary. His fingers, usually steady when signing million-dollar contracts, trembled as he carefully aligned the torn pages. The mansion felt eerily quiet, with only the occasional creak of the old building settling around him. David smoothed out a particularly damaged page, where his wife's elegant handwriting remained intact despite Linda's attempts to destroy it. "Never let our daughter feel alone," he read, the words hitting him like a physical blow. His throat tightened as memories flooded back, of promises made at a hospital bedside, of a hand growing cold in his own, of vows he had so thoroughly broken. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room. Tears blurred his vision as the full weight of his failure crashed down upon him. For years he had buried himself in work, using Smith Corporation as both shield and excuse. While he'd been closing deals and expanding his empire, Emily had been left to face Linda's cruelty alone, with only Mrs. Johnson's kindness as a buffer. The businessman ran his hand over his face, feeling the stubble of too many late nights. On the desk beside the diary lay the morning newspaper, with its damning headline about his alleged neglect. The irony was bitter. The accusation was false in intent, but painfully true in reality. David carefully placed the reconstructed diary in his safe, vowing that no one would ever damage it again. He checked his watch, nearly midnight, and made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days before. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel all my meetings tomorrow," he instructed, his voice firm with newfound resolve. "Family emergency." When morning came, Emily was stunned to see her father waiting by her wheelchair, dressed casually in jeans rather than his usual tailored suit. "Dad, don't you have that merger meeting today?" she asked, confusion evident in her eyes. "Nothing more important than this," he replied, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. For the first time in years, David accompanied his daughter to her physical therapy session, watching with a mixture of pride and heartache as Dr. Martinez guided Emily through exercises that clearly caused pain, but which she faced with unwavering determination. As Emily gripped the parallel bars, sweat beading on her forehead, David stood nearby, offering encouragement with each labored step. In her struggle, he saw not weakness, but a strength he himself had forgotten. The father realized that in trying to provide financially for his daughter, he had deprived her of what she truly needed: his presence, his support, his love. The physical therapy center bustled with activity as Dr. Sarah Martinez guided Emily Smith through her exercises. The room smelled of antiseptic and determination, filled with various patients working through their own challenges. Unlike previous sessions where Emily had faced these struggles alone, today was different. "Just a few more, Emily. You're doing great," Dr. Martinez encouraged, her experienced hands supporting the girl's leg through another stretch. Emily grimaced, sweat beading on her forehead as pain shot through her muscles. David Smith stood nearby, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, a stark contrast to his usual polished appearance. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving his daughter. "You've got this, sweetheart," he whispered, reaching for her hand when she extended it in a moment of particular discomfort. "I'm right here." Emily squeezed her father's fingers, drawing strength from his presence. The therapist nodded approvingly at their interaction, recognizing how the emotional support enhanced the physical progress. "Your daughter has remarkable determination," Dr. Martinez told David as Emily completed her final repetition. "She never complains, even when I know it hurts." David's eyes glistened with a mixture of pride and regret. "She gets that from her mother," he said softly, helping Emily back into her wheelchair. After the session, they sat together in the center's small cafe. Emily sipped a smoothie, her cheeks flushed with exertion, but her eyes brighter than they had been in months. "You didn't have to miss work for this," she said, though her tone betrayed how much his presence meant. Her father shook his head. "This is more important. I should have been here all along." He hesitated, then added, "I found some of your mother's notes last night, about the exercises she used to do with you." Emily's eyes widened. "You did?" "I thought maybe we could try them at home, together," David suggested, his voice thick with emotion. For the first time in years, Emily felt truly supported, not just physically, but emotionally. The wall between them was finally crumbling. Their moment of connection was shattered when a breaking news alert flashed across the television mounted on the cafe wall. The volume suddenly increased as other patrons turned to watch. "Smith Corporation faces bankruptcy amid scandal." The headline scrolled across the screen as a serious-faced reporter detailed allegations of financial misconduct. David's face drained of color. Emily reached for his hand this time. Their roles momentarily reversed. "Dad?" she whispered, fear creeping back into her voice. He squeezed her hand, but his eyes remained fixed on the screen, where images of Linda and Michael Davis appeared, both looking smugly confident as they entered a courthouse. "It's gonna be okay," David said automatically, though uncertainty laced his words. The storm they thought had passed was only gathering strength, threatening to wash away their fragile new beginning. Despite the financial storm threatening to engulf the Smith Corporation, Emily Smith made a decision that surprised everyone. She entered the school's annual writing contest, a prestigious event that drew participants from across the district. The theme was home, and while most students wrote about physical structures, Emily had something entirely different in mind. In the quiet of her room, with Mrs. R. Johnson bringing her occasional cups of hot chocolate, Emily poured her heart into an essay titled My Mother's Home. David found her late one night, still writing by lamplight, her wheelchair positioned by the window where stars glimmered like distant promises. "Dad," she whispered, "do you think Mom would be proud?" The businessman who once prioritized boardrooms over bedtime stories knelt beside his daughter and read her words. His eyes glistened with tears as he nodded, unable to speak. The evening of the contest arrived with an auditorium packed with parents, teachers, and students. Emily wore a blue dress that matched her mother's favorite color, her hair adorned with a simple clip Mrs. Johnson had given her. David sat in the front row, his usual suit replaced by casual clothes, his attention fully on his daughter rather than his buzzing smartphone. When Emily's name was called, Mr. Brown helped navigate her wheelchair onto the stage. A hush fell over the crowd as this young girl, whose life had become tabloid fodder, positioned herself before the microphone. "Home isn't made of bricks or wood," she began, her voice soft but unwavering. "My mother taught me that home is where memories live, where love doesn't die even when people do." She spoke of mathematics as her sanctuary, of her mother's journal as her compass, and of her father's return as her foundation. "We're rebuilding our home," she concluded, "not with walls that can crumble, but with trust that can't be broken." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of sniffling throughout the auditorium. Mrs. Miller, a teacher known for her composure, walked onto the stage with tears streaming down her face. She embraced Emily, whispering loud enough for the microphone to catch. You've shown us what home truly means." Someone recorded the reading on their device, uploading it to social media. By morning, Emily's words had reached hundreds of thousands, then millions. The video spread across the city and beyond, changing hearts and perspectives about the Smith family. Comments flooded in, many from people who had judged them harshly based on headlines alone. For the first time since her mother's passing, Emily felt truly seen, not as the disabled daughter of a millionaire, but as herself, a girl with a voice worth hearing. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Linda Evans and Michael Davis launched their final assault. Their lawsuit against David Smith alleged severe neglect of his disabled daughter, painting him as a callous millionaire who prioritized business over family. Reporters packed the benches, cameras flashing as the bitter custody battle unfolded before Judge Williams. Linda took the stand first, tears streaming down her face as she described finding Emily alone for hours. Allegedly unfed and uncared for, that poor child deserved better, she sobbed, her performance nearly flawless. Michael nodded supportively from his seat, their plans seemingly unfolding perfectly. The prosecution's attorney paced dramatically. "And what did you observe about Mr. Smith's relationship with his daughter?" "He was never there," Linda replied, voice breaking. "Always working, always absent." When David's attorney called Mrs. Johnson to testify, the elderly housekeeper straightened her shoulders and spoke with quiet dignity. "In my 20 years with the Smith family, I've never seen a father more devastated by his wife's death or more determined to protect his child," she stated firmly. It was Linda who brought darkness into that home. Mr. Brown corroborated her account, describing how he'd witnessed Linda tearing Emily's notebook and threatening the child. "I drove Miss Linda away that night on Mr. Smith's orders," he testified. The young miss was terrified of her stepmother, not her father. The courtroom fell silent when Emily Smith wheeled herself to the witness stand. Her small frame seemed fragile under the harsh lights, but her eyes burned with determination. The prosecutor approached, his voice deliberately gentle. "Emily, did your father ever leave you alone?" She gripped the arms of her wheelchair. "My father works hard to provide for me, but he never abandoned me." But these hospital records show multiple injuries. From physical therapy and learning to navigate my disability, Emily interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Don't use my legs to deny my mind. My father never abandoned me. It was Linda who tried to destroy everything I loved." Emily described the night Linda had torn her notebook and attempted to destroy her mother's diary. Her voice trembled, but never broke, as she recounted years of subtle cruelty hidden behind closed doors. "My father made mistakes," she admitted, looking directly at David. "But he came back. He chose me." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause. Judge Williams banged her gavel for order, but her eyes shone with unmistakable emotion. Even the most hardened reporters were scribbling furiously, the narrative shifting before their eyes. As Emily finished her testimony, the tide of public opinion visibly turned. What had begun as a media circus targeting a wealthy businessman was transforming into a story of resilience, redemption, and a father and daughter fighting to rebuild what had been broken. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the verdict, her voice clear and unwavering. Linda and Michael Davis were found guilty on all counts of slander, defamation, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced them to 3 years in prison, her gavel striking with finality. The journalist who had eagerly spread their fabricated stories had her license permanently revoked. David Smith stood tall, his shoulders finally free from the weight that had burdened them for months. Tears glistened in his eyes as the judge declared him fully exonerated of all charges. Emily reached for her father's hand, squeezing it tightly, as whispers of vindication rippled through the courtroom. "It's over, Dad," she whispered, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Mrs. Johnson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Mr. Brown nodded solemnly from his seat behind them. The loyal housekeeper had testified passionately about the transformation she'd witnessed in the Smith household, how a broken family had begun to heal despite Linda's cruelty. As Linda was led away in handcuffs, she shot one final venomous glare at Emily. The girl met her stepmother's gaze unflinchingly, no longer the frightened child cowering in her wheelchair. Michael avoided eye contact entirely, his business empire already crumbling around him. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but this time their questions held respect rather than accusation. Dr. Martinez stood among the crowd, beaming with pride at her patient's strength. Nearby, Jacob and his classmates held homemade signs of support, cheering as Emily emerged. "How does it feel to have justice, Emily?" one reporter asked, thrusting a microphone forward. The young mathematician smiled, her mother's journal safely tucked in her backpack. "This wasn't about winning," she replied. "It was about truth and finding our way home." David knelt beside his daughter's wheelchair, no longer the distant businessman, but a father fully present. "I made you a promise," he said softly, "and I intend to keep it." In the weeks that followed, the Smith mansion transformed. The cold marble halls warmed with laughter. Emily's equations no longer hid on notebook pages, but decorated her bedroom walls with her father's encouragement. Mrs. Johnson baked cookies, while Mr. Brown taught Emily to play chess in the garden. One evening, as father and daughter sat reviewing Emily's latest mathematical theorem, David looked up at the portrait of his late wife. "She would be so proud of you," he whispered. Emily smiled, her resilience shining brighter than any equation. Together, they had rebuilt their home, not from wealth or status, but from trust, forgiveness, and the unbreakable courage of a little girl who had refused to let darkness win.